Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy seminar on global issues in allocating vaccines and other issues to do with drug shortages during the COVID-19 outbreak. Today, I'm joined by colleagues, Kenny Tan, who is a faculty member at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy and a community pharmacy owner, Alan Mills, who is the director of pharmacy at Trillium, and Dr. Mina Tadras, who is a scientist at Women's College Hospital and a graduate of our graduate program in pharmaceutical sciences. And it's a pleasure to have you all here today. Today, we're going to start with a presentation that I've put together about some work that I've been doing with colleagues both in Ontario for the bioethics table that's advising the Ministry of Health and Ontario Health, as well as colleagues internationally as part of a coalition of scientists and social scientists and ethicists who are advising Germany, Austria, and Switzerland on ethical issues to do with public health ethics and COVID-19. I'll just share my slides with you. So the first part of our presentation today will be addressing the global challenge that we're all facing about how we prioritize access to a COVID-19 vaccine. So, as most of you will know, we need a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine as part of a broader strategy for controlling the outbreak that we face at the moment across the globe. And it plays an important role in protecting people from infection and reducing mortality and morbidity globally. It will aid in economic recovery, which will also help with address the harms that are arising from the economic hardship facing people due to the crash of the global economy and due to the restrictive measures that have been put in place. And vaccines will play a more or less critical role depending on the part of the world that people are living in terms of the overall strategy for mitigating the harms from COVID-19. In particular, parts of the world where restrictive measures are absolutely devastating for the population are going to be particularly reliant on a vaccine to help control the epidemic. And here's just a snapshot of some of the stories about the impact of restrictive measures. This is the impact primarily on hunger in these communities, but also there are huge economic hardships for people in countries where there is no social safety net to help people when they face unemployment and job loss. And these issues are continuing to emerge on a daily basis. Yesterday, Tedros, the head of the global World Health Organization agency, has stated that there is still a very long way to go during this pandemic, and they're seeing a rise in cases in low and middle income countries at the same time that we're seeing high income countries having the first signs of success in dropping case numbers. So we're far from out of the woods. So where are we in the development of a vaccine globally? Well, here in Canada, we're about to see the first human trials of a vaccine in Halifax. And so this is promising to see that human trials are progressing. In other parts of the world, there are at least 169 possible vaccine candidates. Not all of these will be successful. In fact, probably most of them will not be. 12 of them are currently in the stage of undergoing clinical trials, including this one in Halifax. And only one trial to date is past phase 2. Sorry, that should say the 3 phases for vaccine trials, and that is in Beijing. The role of the World Health Organization has been questioned somewhat. The WHO is running what they call the Solidarity Trial, and their aim is to accelerate the discovery of a safe and effective vaccine. And they have some objectives that are listed here, and you'll note that there is emphasis on a broad global coalition of scientists and politicians and philanthropists and non-governmental organizations to bring and develop candidate vaccines to market. And part of this is also coordinating the clinical trials across the world, which is what the Solidarity Trial is all about. And their focus is really on the development of a safe and effective vaccine for all. And for all is a key phrase here. So what we know is that demand is going to outstrip the immediate supply of any vaccine, which is why we need to be talking about who will get it first. Billions of doses will be required, and this is a fairly unique situation. Even influenza requires millions of doses. So this is orders of magnitude greater need across the globe for a vaccine. However, there is limited global capacity to manufacture vaccines, and that is largely concentrated in high-income countries. And there are serious and long-standing barriers to equitable global access to vaccines. And there are also questions about whether or not to divert resources for the development and manufacturing and distribution of a COVID vaccine from the manufacturing and distribution of other crucial vaccines that we already use, such as measles, mumps, and rubella, or polio. So how should we approach the allocation of a COVID vaccine or vaccines, as the case may be? So we have one option, which is to do what we always do, which is a sort of business as usual model. And that would be to allow the vaccine to be allocated through market forces. And basically that means your ability to pay will determine whether or not you get the vaccine, either at a national level or at an individual level. We might see countries nationalize their supply, which basically roughly translates into saving the vaccine for themselves and not sharing it, reminiscent of the early days of the pandemic when we saw people hoarding toilet paper. And only later we will see a drop in the price of a vaccine that will be negotiated by global agencies like Gavi, CEPI, or UNICEF, which generally is the world's mechanism for getting vaccines to people in low substantial delays in immunizing the poorest and the most vulnerable people in the world. So business as usual here makes no sense in an epidemiological sense, because we know that unless we are all working on this together and coordinating a global effort, that leaves everybody vulnerable. And there really is no way to justify this approach morally. However, we have seen that some people are bullish on this strategy, and Donald Trump has been in trouble with the global community for trying to buy a German manufacturer early on in this pandemic who had a promising vaccine candidate for priority access for Americans. And just today, we've seen that the US has negotiated priority access for 300 million doses of a potential vaccine that AstraZeneca is working on, along with a couple of other countries. And they are justifying this as part of their Operation Warp Speed, which is their program of research aimed at getting a vaccine before January. So they already have a number of other deals struck with Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Sanofi. And this has really sparked a lot of fears that the richest countries will be able to protect their citizens first. Sanofi, I should mention, had an agreement with the US, but I think that they have been walking that back. And you can see that the CEO has been sort of reprimanded by the French Prime Minister, and they have backed off from this and saying now that they will ensure that there is equal access for everybody. So we'll continue to see this kind of jockeying for priority access. The other option is to follow the lead of the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who has been at the head of the European Commission's effort to create a global coordination strategy called the Coronavirus Global Response, which is a coalition of France, Germany, other countries like Norway, big name philanthropists like Bill Gates, and other organizations like Gavi and CEPI to work together to raise money for a vaccine, but also to start a conversation about how these resources will be shared. And so you can see that there's a sense of the common good emerging in this conversation, and that governments and global health organizations will join forces against coronavirus. And notably at their big donor conference where the money was raised for this effort, China and the US were absent. So how can ethics guide the allocation of these resources? So I've been involved in work with colleagues actually across the globe, and this map here will show you the turnaround time was about 48 hours for the development of this document that was going to that donor conference that I was just speaking about that the European Commission organized. This was a policy brief for the German government to take to that donor meeting to set that conversation going about how the global allocation for a vaccine should proceed. And we had about just over 24 hours to pull something together here. So just as a side note, this is a really interesting example of global cooperation and solidarity within the research community to pull something together. And so we started off at the beginning with a colleague in Sydney. He passed it off to a colleague who's currently in Singapore. She went to bed and I picked it up in Toronto and worked on it for a few hours. I sent it to Washington and then Annette Rid at the Department of Bioethics at the NIH, she worked on it for a bit, and then we sent it to Germany, where it got a final review by our coordinators, and it was passed off to the government. So this was just a great example of the kind of collaboration that's happening globally in the ethics community, but it's happening all around this issue about vaccine research and development. So the underlying premise of that document that we passed along with the ethics framework for allocating a vaccine globally was that we should be thinking about a vaccine as a global public good. And that will require us to use an approach that is solidaristic in order to get a vaccine that is safe and effective, but also one that is distributed fairly. And you'll see here that China has now pledged to make its coronavirus vaccine a public good. So you're seeing this language of vaccine as a public good, which has been in the ethics literature for a long time, but it's interesting to see this now being part of the public conversation. So our framework also stated that any SARS-CoV-2 vaccine must be distributed fairly across the world. And there are a number of reasons why we said this. First of all, freedom from infection is a global public good, and we will all benefit if we can control the spread of the virus. So this approach, we need to approach this problem as a global problem and act in solidarity. We also need to view this as a humanitarian crisis and a threat to global security as much as it is a health crisis and to individual as well as collective well-being. And so vaccine distribution has to be coordinated globally to minimize the harms that are not being felt evenly across the world. And that we know that racialized groups and people with lower socioeconomic status in our own communities are harder hit by this, and the same is true on a global scale as well. So the global capacity to manufacture vaccines is unequal, and we have more than 80% of the global population currently living in low and middle income countries. And so if we don't address those inequalities in the ability to manufacture vaccines, we are going to be leaving 80% of the world high and dry. And justice requires that we focus on equity issues when we're making these decisions. So we need to make sure that people are not disadvantaged from a chance of receiving the benefit of a vaccine just because of where they happen to live. And how we can do this, it needs to be founded on this sort of utilitarian approach where we're maximizing the benefit from any vaccine that comes available in reducing global mortality and morbidity. So distribution needs to be based on sound infection control principles as well as the best available evidence. So prioritizing epicenters of current outbreaks or outbreaks where they are happening at the time a vaccine becomes available. We need to prioritize people who are living in countries and regions with the inadequate capacity to respond to the pandemic using non-pharmaceutical interventions like social distancing or restrictive measures. And as you saw previously, those have a really disproportionate impact on poor people and people who are living in close quarters and people with precarious employment. And we also need to prioritize essential workers who are needed to maintain and restore healthcare systems and outbreak response and societal functioning. So that would be healthcare workers and other people who are essential to the functioning of society. And this, for our audience, it seems like a no-brainer, but we should not be discriminatory when we allocate vaccines. We need to make sure that people's interests count equally across the globe unless there are good reasons that justify a differential prioritization of vaccines. So do we need to prioritize particular countries or groups to maximize the benefits of a vaccine? We also need to look about things that we have codified in human rights documents, that any of these irrelevant individual or group characteristics are not factored into decision-making, like race, color, sex, language, religion. Obviously, the issue around men being disproportionately ill-affected by COVID-19 may be relevant epidemiologically, but for the sake of it, you would need to have a very good justification for, would have to not be an arbitrary decision to prioritize those groups or to withhold from particular groups based on these factors. And any allocation is going to need to protect the most vulnerable from harm. And this can be a tricky one to parse when we're talking about vaccines. We know that people do not all respond equally to a vaccine, particularly people who suffer poor nutritional status or comorbidities may not have the same immune response to a vaccine. So these are things we need to be thinking about as well. But we should be prioritizing people who are the most vulnerable biologically and or socially. And so socially vulnerable people would be people who are more likely to suffer the ill effects of quarantine or COVID itself. And this applies to the distribution within a country, but also across countries. And so we need to include those whose vulnerabilities is a result of inequities in health to begin with, and wealth, so the health wealth gradient and other prior injustices. So, not all inequalities are unjust, but for those that are, we should be prioritizing those groups as well. So thank you for listening to me talk about my work on with the colleagues across the world on global prioritization for COVID-2 vaccine. Now I'd like to open the conversation up to ground things a little bit more locally in terms of how pharmaceutical supply issues are impacting community pharmacy, hospital pharmacy, and we'll turn to a conversation towards the end of the talk about the drug supply chain more broadly and why we're seeing some of these issues emerge today. Okay. So my first question as a moderator, I'm switching to moderator now, is for our colleague, Kenny Tan. And I just wanted, Kenny, if you could give us a sense of how community pharmacies are being impacted by this pandemic.
Yeah, I think the I think every community pharmacy has certainly experienced a lot of uplift in terms of prescriptions because everybody's scared that they're going to run out of medications. As it stands right now in terms of that landscape, there have been a lot of drug shortages even prior to COVID. So with that in mind, certainly a lot of patients, I would say probably in the second week of March, about the 9th or so, started really refilling their medications significantly. So that's obviously caused a lot of, extra work for the pharmacists and, a lot of extra people coming through the stores. That's definitely a huge impact that we saw initially. So yeah, patients definitely wanted to try and get their medications. So in that respect, the Ontario government had recommended, I think the date was about March 20th, that we only fill 30 days of medications for our ODB patients. So we've done that to help with that control of that process as well. So that has its challenges as well in terms of payments that now the patients have now incurred because they have to pay every time they dispense. And in this case, usually we fill a 90-day supply, so we'd only fill it 4 times a year. So if we're going to a 30-day supply, then that changes the whole dynamics of things. So that added a lot of stress to the pharmacy in the sense that the patients wouldn't have normally paid for their fees, but now they kind of had to. So there was a lot of negative sentiment, obviously, on that because that put pressure on all the seniors and all our social assistance patients in order to get their meds. So having said that, the Ministry of Health and ODB did, as of May 14th, said that they would cover the fees. So that's the great thing about it. So now the government is saying that, we'll cover the fees for our ODB clients and patients. So now they're no longer paying that. But there was a stretch of time where there were a lot of angry customers and patients, to be quite honest with you. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, Kenny, if when the government said to limit the prescription refills to every 30 days, was that only for the patients who received the Ontario drug benefit, or was that for all patients?
Well, they recommended that for certainly ODB patients, but with that being said, I think that was an overall sentiment that they were trying to push out there, I think, for everybody to send everybody a message. I think it was definitely well intended, and obviously the situation was extremely fluid, as we know. So therefore, the fixes and the payments maybe they didn't consider until a little bit later, but it is what it is, and we had to deal with it on the front lines as well as with literally we're talking about 50% increases in prescriptions being filled in those 2 weeks.
Wow.
So after that, it has definitely settled down. People are on their second fills now, so it's gotten a little bit less busy, but still busy nonetheless.
So were you actually seeing drug shortages when that was happening, or are you still seeing them?
Well, in general, there were 100% there were even drug shortages pre-COVID, but would I say that there's extensively more? I don't think there will be extensively more. I think maybe in the future months there might be, but I didn't see that there were that many additional shortages, let's say.
And did you become aware of any pharmacies that were starting to sort of stockpile medications themselves preemptively?
Yeah, like our pharmacy didn't. I mean, we generally have a good supply on as a general rule of thumb, and many pharmacy management systems do that. So, you can kind of mandate your system to keep, a 60-day supply or 90-day supply. So based on that, that's, inherently my pharmacy might only stock for 30 days, whereas, the pharmacy down the street might stock for 60 days. So it really depends on the systems. But from my I know we didn't stockpile. Alison, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. What role, Kenny, do you see for community pharmacists as a vaccine becomes available? Is there a role for pharmacists in terms of immunization strategy for public health once we have a vaccine, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of dissemination of getting everybody vaccinated, we've obviously in Ontario taken a huge role in that with regards to the influenza vaccine. So yeah, we're ready and prepared to do that to that extent. I mean, obviously it will be very busy when that happens, but I think we will all be thankful for that time that it does happen. Yeah, we definitely, I think, play a key role in that. Like in my pharmacy alone, we did about the 1,600 vaccinations last year on just this influenza vaccine alone. So, we certainly will decrease the costs of that, instead of them seeing their physicians for sure.
Great. Thank you, Kenny. I'll turn now to asking Alan Mills a little bit about what's happening in our hospitals and how hospital drug supplies are being impacted by this outbreak.
Well, when the outbreak first happened, when the pandemic started, we started to hear about drug shortages in other jurisdictions and other hospitals. So, for example, Northern Italy, and when New York was impacted, we knew that we were going to run short on critical care drugs. So where I work, Trillium Health Partners, we had 26 COVID patients in our ICUs, which is about 11% of the COVID patients at that time. We assumed that the reason that they were running short on the meds was because of the volume of patients. But we were very, very surprised, in fact, that those patients actually used an awful lot of medications. They were sometimes younger patients than we're used to, and they were on ventilators and they were paralyzed for a prolonged period of time, some of them for weeks, which is not our normal practice. We try and prevent as much as possible keeping people on ventilators for a prolonged period of times. So over a very short course of time, we found that we went through a significant amount of our neuromuscular blockers, our sedatives, our narcotics. Even though we were told these would be the agents that we would be using, and most of our care in the hospitals, we try and protocolize, we try to standardize as much as we possibly can, but we were just shocked at how much we were actually using. I'll give you an example. One of their neuromuscular blockers, cisatracurium, over a 3.5-day period of time, we went through 4 weeks of cisatracurium at a normal utilization rate, which we were at one point down to having a half-day supply left of cisatracurium. And this is despite us going to the group purchasing organizations beforehand and saying, are you sure the manufacturers are able to make the active pharmaceutical ingredients? Are you sure that they're going to be able to supply us? And the manufacturers assured us, yes, there seems to be no interruption to the API. We're going to be able to get you these products. It was just a shock at how much we were using. And we actually started to run very close on some of our products.
So was the issue that they couldn't keep up with the demand, or was it has that resolved itself at this point?
It has to a point. What we started to do is we started to share information across the province and across provinces about how we were using the medications, how much we were using. We started talking about alternatives, how we could use alternatives, how we could get the same clinical outcome for our patients by using a secondary or tertiary med, maybe a med that our hospital isn't used to, but another hospital is. So over a period of time, we started to work together as a group of provincial hospital pharmacists working with the government, both the Ministry of Health as well as the federal government, to try and start importing medications that aren't usually used in Canada, not usually the brands that we would use. So for example, we're bringing in right now 2% propofol to replace our 1% propofol because we just don't have enough of a supply in Canada. I think it's important to realize the Canadian marketplace is very small. It's about 3% or so of the global pharmaceutical marketplace. Hospital pharmacy in Canada is even smaller. It's about 0.3. So we didn't have a lot of backup capacity within the system. And we started to realize that early on, basically in early April, that if we continue to use these medications at these rates, and if we saw growth in patients, we would be in significant challenges very early. So that was one of the ways that we worked together to see if we could actually utilize alternative medications as much as possible. Oh, I think you're muted.
How did you feel about having to identify alternatives that maybe not quite as effective, or was there an impact on you and the other pharmacists who were having to make these decisions?
Yeah, Kenny alluded to this before. We've been living through drug shortages for a prolonged period of time. So we're quite used to coming back to secondary alternatives as long as there's evidence that that alternative is going to give an equivalent outcome for the patients. So for example, when we started running short on fentanyl infusions, we started using hydromorphone in those patients where the hydromorphone would give an equivalent outcome to the fentanyl. We actually had to go to morphine infusions for a very small subpopulation because morphine isn't optimal. It does place stress on the staff though. And we put systems in place to make it so that the care is as safe as possible, that we try and eliminate any variables that will lead to medication errors, particularly in a critical care population where a small change or a small error can have a significant outcome. So it puts a lot of stress on the staff. Our pharmacists, I'm really proud of them. They've stepped up. They've had these conversations with the team. They've led these conversions to new therapies for these patients. They've been monitoring these patients very closely to make sure that they're getting the outcomes. But it is stressful. And it's stressful in two ways. It's stressful because they're having to make decisions that we don't want them making. We'd rather have them make decisions around what the optimal therapy is and how we're going to optimize that therapy. The second part of this is just the stress of what's happening in the ICUs and what's happening on the floors. We're used to being able to produce good outcomes for our patients. We're used to having therapeutic alternatives with information that would show if you treat this condition with these therapeutic alternatives, these are the likely outcomes for these patients. In this case, we don't have a lot of good information around COVID-19. We don't have a lot of great treatments right now. So we are not having the success rate on our intubated COVID patients that we'd normally have. And that's very distressing for staff.
Yeah, I think there will be a lot of need to address the sort of moral distress of care providers in these circumstances, and certainly drug shortages are playing in a role in creating that moral distress that care providers are experiencing across the board, I think. I just wanted to ask you quickly as our last question, Alan, about how does a hospital play a role in terms of when we get a vaccine? What does that look like in where you work?
Yeah, we tend to. I mean, I can give you the examples of what we've done with the flu vaccine. We tend to vaccinate both the population, in other words, the community we serve, as well as our staff. When we get a COVID vaccine, we're going to have to work through some frameworks, and we're going to have to understand through some kind of ethical framework how we target specific populations. And for example, do we start with our patients or do we start with our staff? If there's a limited supply of the COVID vaccine, are we looking at our staff as potential vectors? In other words, they're going to give it to patients, or are we looking at protecting the most vulnerable patients? I'm not sure we're going to have great information about the efficacy of any COVID vaccine. Not like, the years of experience that we have with a flu vaccine or other vaccinations. We're going to have a unified approach as hospitals, hospital pharmacists about how we support this. We definitely support, as Kenny does, giving the vaccines. We make sure that we identify patients. We make sure that those patients that are at risk get the vaccine in a coordinated fashion. But if there's a shortage of the vaccine, we're really going to have to lean on a particular framework that will allow us to make it a rational, ethical decision about who gets it first.
Thank you, Alan. I'll turn now to Mina. And Mina, so you've heard from both of these guys, and I know you're well aware that so drug shortages are not new to Canada, but what's happening right now? Like, where do you see the issues in the supply chain?
Yeah, that's I think like both my colleagues said, the supply chain and drug supply issues are not new, but just like everything that we're seeing, and there's been a general theme with all things COVID, is that it's really put pressure on and shown the cracks in the system. And there was a major crack in our drug supply chain. And this has been, a concerning issue that's been getting worse over the last few years. But traditionally, prior to COVID, what we saw is various components of the supply chain breaking down, and we had very little insight into the supply chain itself. And one really great example was a shortage that happened about last year, where we basically realized that 10 generic drug versions of the same drug, valsartan, all came from the same manufacturing site, or they were producing the same active ingredient, or what we term an API. And they were all coming from the same factory. And so when COVID started to brew in China, what was happening is we were concerned because 80 to 90% of all API is produced in only two countries, China and India. And so we were really concerned that if they started shutting down, which they did, that we would have a supply issue. And that was the original concern. What we didn't anticipate was this demand side shift, which also has really increased the pressure on the system as well, which is what Kenny was alluding to when he said that people were starting to fill scripts more often, sort of the toilet paper phenomenon, right? And when that happened, we saw a demand shift. There's also a different layer to it, which I think Alan talked about, which is a shifting use in drugs for populations we'd never seen. Interestingly, for example, like there's a shortage currently of salbutamol inhalers, and partly that was related to community pharmacies starting to fill more of those. Patients with asthma were concerned that this is a respiratory illness and they'll be affected greatly. But we also saw hospitals starting to shift to use more inhalers, concerned with infection control. And so this wasn't a supply issue. This was a sudden spike in demand over a period of 2 weeks. Now, I think when we saw that, it became very apparent that this is this COVID problem is really shifting the way that we deal with drug supply. And it really showed that we have no good grasp of the drug supply chain, because it is a massively global issue, and so is COVID. And so that's been a really interesting learning experience for all of us that kind of monitor drug supply.
So do you think this is something we could have anticipated or been better prepared for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think what we've been talking about, we didn't have enough time to gear up, but the conversation over the last 5 years has been around how do we actually introduce and better understand the risks in our drug supply when it comes to a lot of different factors that are associated with it. And there's been a lot of work happening, and a lot of us have been trying to think about how do we, one, monitor the drug supply. We actually don't even know how much drug is inside our border. We don't know how much, when we think about drug supplies, it's not just what's on the shelves in the hospital pharmacy or in the community pharmacy. Before them, there's a wholesaler, there's a distributor, and then outside of our borders, there's the factories where they box them. So for example, the drugs that are being brought in from that are labeled as other countries are probably the exact same drugs that we were getting. They just have different labeling. And so they're considered a product for another country. And so those are boxed somewhere. And then prior to that, so there's a whole supply chain. So when a shortage is announced, we actually have a lag time, and often it's months before it impacts the patient. But we don't have a good way to track how much is there. We don't even know how risky some drugs are. For example, that valsartan example, we thought, if you asked me on the surface, would you be worried about valsartan? I'd say no, we have like 12 generic versions of it. Little did I realize, and I think little did most people realize, that it was all coming from the exact same factory. And so I think developing those insights and understanding what risks are is going to be the way into the future. And there's a lot of conversations, and you're starting to see it south of the border, where there's conversations about how do we look at high risk medications? Like, for example, there's some drugs that are used in the hospital that have no alternative. And do we need to make sure that those are either produced in multiple countries, produced inside our own country? Like, how do we think about those things? And I just think we didn't have enough time to gear up, but absolutely, there's a lot of strategies that could have at least mitigated the potential impact of this.
And in terms of going back to the vaccine issue, in your previous life, you looked at issues around vaccines as well. So I'm wondering if you could comment on, what is the situation with manufacturing capacity globally for a vaccine?
Yeah, so vaccine capacity is even more challenging, and we see this with highly complicated agents that need to be produced in biological environments, right? These aren't just like manufacturing sites where there's a factory and a chemical reaction. These things, in a sense, are, for lack of a better term, grown. And so they need a much more complicated, controlled, higher level manufacturing sites. And so the vast majority of vaccines are actually produced in just a handful of sites around the world, and they're clustered around mostly developed countries, bigger sites. And we have a very high risk system. I'll give you an example. So a lot of biologic drugs and some vaccines are produced in Puerto Rico. And so when Puerto Rico got hit with the hurricane, we saw a massive disruption of the drug supply chain. So as we get even just one place going down, a small island state, really impacted the global supply chain of medications. And I think when we think about gearing up to produce, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dosages in months, it's going to be very challenging to start thinking about that. And how do we align all these competing companies that are trying to produce this and understand whoever wins the race, we have to use each other's capacity and start to play nice and think about some of those things. So from a manufacturing standpoint, I think we should be planning that now so that we understand once we get a winner, I use that in quotations, how are we going to produce it? And is there an opportunity for everyone to collaborate? And should we be thinking about developing vaccine sites and manufacturing from now, knowing that we're going to need one in the future?
And just to your point about sounds like we have all our eggs in one basket or in a very few baskets. And then I think if you throw in, that there are different kinds of vaccines, right? There's live attenuated vaccines, there are, non-live virus vaccines. So if we refine depending on what kind of vaccine ends up working, does that mean there will be even fewer of the sites that are able to produce a vaccine?
Well, I think they would have to be fitted, right? I think that a lot of the manufacturing processes differ based on if you're using a live or an attenuated. They have some components that are similar, and I think that you could fit some of the things within them. And often these large sites are producing multiple different types of vaccines. They just don't have the full capacity. Some of my previous work, like, a large volume of influenza vaccines are produced in Liverpool, UK, for example. They have a huge, site that does that. Sanofi has a huge site in Toronto that produces some of the vaccines for us. But they're fitted to be producing currently what the current demand is, right? MMR, DTaP, whatever it may be that's actually currently needed. And so some of that retrofitting may not be easy, right? Like to like rejig it to make sure that capacity is there. Another thing we don't quite understand is we're assuming it's going to be a one-shot wonder. What if the vaccine and the biological plausibility ends up being something that you need boosters, multiple dosages, annual vaccinations, right? That means that we probably need new sites. And who's gonna pony up and pay that bill?
These are such simple problems we're facing.
Problems for a Thursday afternoon. Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. I'm wondering if you have any insights into. So India is a big player in manufacturing generics. In terms of getting vaccines to low and middle income countries, how optimistic are you that we can strike some sort of equitable agreement globally around this?
So there's two sides of this, right? Like, I think that I do believe that people understand now how much of a global issue this is. And so even if you appeal to their selfish nature and say, okay, fine, like you want to make sure you knock this thing out so it doesn't affect your country, it also means that you need to make sure it's controlled in other countries or it will end up coming back to you, right? And so from a global perspective, we no longer can just ignore other countries and think we're well within our borders. And so it goes counter the narrative of shut down your borders, because even as much as you try to shut down your borders, things do still, permutate. I think the second thing that we have to think about when we think about this issue is that what's become very, very obvious is this very quickly becomes not a public health issue, but a geopolitical issue. And so geopolitics starts to play with silly things, with countries trying to mandate companies, give them first dibs, to countries like India saying that drugs only stay within our borders. And so it becomes a play because, they do, politicians do serve their citizens. They're not elected. I'm not voting for the Prime Minister of India or the President of the United States. And so he's not serving me, he's serving his citizens. And so that becomes an issue there where they try to, and if the current sentiment in that country is more nationalistic in that sense, you have to face up against those. And I think we saw that very rapidly where countries began sort of hanging on to whatever treatment of the week we thought we had, and they were trying to control their supply. So we can't be ignoring that. And I think, the work that you've been highlighting early on, and those conversations need to start now, so that when we do have a vaccine that's ready to go, we're not like, okay, how do we divvy this up now?
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that we should probably try and take some questions from our viewing audience. So thank you to all of you, and I'm going to ask Kate to facilitate the questions, and we'll see who is best placed to answer them. Okay, so our first question is, the US has recently secured 300 million doses for a potential vaccine from AstraZeneca. What can the global community or individual pharma companies do to avoid vaccines going to the highest bidder? This is the question of the day, I think. I don't know, does anybody have any burning desire to address that question? So I can take a stab at it. I mean, I think what we're seeing here is just a sort of higher stakes version of the age-old problem about asking private companies to serve the public good. And there has been a lot of debate over the years about what the role of a pharmaceutical company is and what their moral obligations are to serve the public's health. And I think this is going to be one of those issues that really sort of galvanizes that conversation. And in terms of what Mina was just saying about how politicized this process will become, there whoever gets their hands on this vaccine will first of all be very wealthy, but also they will have a lot of power. And so I think we need to be looking at there's a saying that we really like in public health ethics, that public health is political, so all these policy decisions are absolutely going to impact the public's health, and how industry plays a role in all of this is central to this, and it's going to probably require the opening up all of these international trade agreements, protection of intellectual property for pharmaceutical products, and trying to incentivize companies to create products that are going to address the public health or global health issues of the day. So I'm not sure I have an answer to the question, but I think it's one of those wicked problems. But Mina.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think we already saw some of these, I'm hoping the attention on this means we get a different answer, but we see this constantly time and time again with pharmaceutical agents, where, we're flat out told that the companies will go to the markets that are most profitable first. And so often, they have a rank order. And so that order has to do with which market is the largest, which one gives them the highest prices, and which one is the most patent friendly. And so the US always gets their drugs first, Europe second, and then they have a list of countries. And often when Canada has tried to tackle some, because we're really being hit hard with how expensive drugs are, we've tried to tackle and update our pharmaceutical policy. What ends up happening is we receive threats from manufacturers saying, fine, you're going to become what they term a third tier country, which is countries that get this often 2 years, 3 years after a treatment. And, sometimes if it's a new blood pressure medication, it's not that big of a deal, and I really don't mind. But when it's like a hepatitis C treatment that comes out and it's a cure, or in this case, it's going to be vaccines, there's no rules to this. The companies get to choose where they go. And I think with the pharmaceuticals, we see that when there are no regulations and it's the market deciding, they do set up tiers. You just need to speak to anyone in a pharmaceutical company. And, in a way, I don't blame them. That's the way that the structure is made. They're a profit-driven organization, and so they go where the profit is. But now, I'm hoping that the attention that's going to be placed on a pandemic vaccine that everyone is anticipating will allow us to think through these structures and make sure that the ground rules are not just around where the most profitable, largest market is.
Absolutely. Second question is for Alan, and the question is about, what are hospitals and hospital pharmacies doing currently to prepare for the eventuality of a second wave in the fall of COVID that would sort of coincide with influenza?
Yeah, we've done a number of things. The first thing we've done is share information about alternatives, share information about strategy, how to safely use those alternatives, what populations would have the best outcomes with a variety of different medications. We've also started to work, as I was stated before, with the provincial governments and also the federal governments around importing other medications. And one of the things that I'm really proud of that the hospital pharmacists in Ontario have done is we've worked to create kind of a hub and spoke model where we've identified through regional leads that will help support smaller hospitals. So for example, those regional leads will work with the province. If there's any supply that's available to the hospitals, they will hold on to that supply as an emergency supply. So if there's any rush on any one hospital, that emergency supply can come in and fill any gaps for that hospital and act as a second depot in case the allocation or the amount that they can actually purchase from the manufacturers are inadequate to treat the patient population that they're actually seeing at that time. Through all this, we're hoping to see enough of a safety net so that all of the hospitals throughout the entire province, no matter what your size, will be supported.
Great. Kenny, do you see any preparations on the community pharmacy side taking place and that sort of regionalization that Alan was just speaking about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that goes back to kind of partially the stockpiling issue. I don't know if we would, I think that definitely in terms of being able to practice in that environment, it was quite, to be very honest with you, it was a chaotic time. So having said that, certainly looking at perhaps labor models and so forth to, stem the tide, so to speak, or even, if and when we are able to get the vaccine in, I'm sure the lineups will be out the door in order to, facilitate that. So I think from that perspective, I think it's important to try and service our patients the best we can in that way.
Thank you. All right, we have another question. So given how we have seen the distribution of PPE and, I think I may have missed another question here. So whose job is it to enforce the protocols for access to the vaccine once they are agreed upon? Which is, I think, another great question. I'll take a stab at that myself. I think that one of the big problems we're facing is the fact that there really is no way, even if there is a global consortium of countries and organizations that agree to work together to set a prioritization framework for distribution of the vaccine on a priority access basis, but there is no global organization that can really enforce that. And so, how do we get countries like the US to come on board and acknowledge that there may be parts of the globe that are in more dire need, or that, putting that sort of nationalistic agenda aside is going to be one of the biggest challenges of all of this. And I think, we've seen it already with other supply chain issues around protective equipment and masks and things like that. So I think that, every time we have an outbreak like this, and this was a big part of the conversation around Ebola, MERS and SARS, is, when countries are not being good global citizens, there's really no way to address that. And countries that sign on to agreements like the international health regulations, even that, there's very, very few ways to actually enforce those things. So what is the role for the WHO here? What is the role for the UN, say, when you have countries like the US saying that they're going to withdraw from these agreements and national collaborative structures? So I think this is a really critical question, and it's going to depend a lot on how the WHO comes through all of this, and whether or not it's still viewed as a legitimate actor in global health. All right, I think we'll take one more question if we have time. I'll just check. Yep, we have one more quick question. So given how we've seen the distribution of PPE and COVID testing play out in a market fashion around the world, what actions are required to preempt that dynamic for the vaccine? So another easy question to answer. Anybody want to take a stab at that one? I mean, maybe we've sort of spoken a little bit to it in the global context, but maybe even within the country or the province, there may be issues around this as well that people could comment on.
Yeah, I just, on this, I think there's probably two thoughts that come to my mind. The first is that, with this question, I'm a little more positive that there's an inevitability that at some point there will be a vaccine produced, knock on wood and all that jazz. But, when it is and when it happens, I'm not a betting person, so I wouldn't bet on that, but it is coming. And so, when it came to thinking about, prior to this, one of the failings of preparing for this was the inevitability of a pandemic wasn't believed by everybody. And so that triggered a lot of impact on how we funded public health initiatives, what we thought about PPE and stocking up. And so there wasn't this idea. And so there's a bit of a debate of how much should you invest, how ready should you be? But I think we should be ready that at some point we're going to have to figure out how to distribute a vaccine, and we're going to have to think about all the nuances when it comes to the clinical sense, distribution, and leveraging our distribution chapters, our channels. The second point I think that comes up to mind for me is that we're going to have a very tight rope between leveraging what's already established in our distribution channels. Like, for example, we can get vaccines out really fast across Canada based on the pharmaceutical distribution that we already have, because it's a network that's established, it has systems, it has cold chain supply, and you can get it into every pharmacy. But if you let go that loosely, you also lose the control of who gets it. So for example, if the vaccine we want to target, say like other vaccines, we want to target 50 plus. I'm just imagining that it's going to become similar to other vaccines where we have age targets. And so we're going to target certain populations. The moment you let it go to pharmacies, it becomes much more challenging, or it lets it go to every doctor's office, not just to pick on pharmacy, but you lose that. But at the same time, if you only distribute it to public health offices and they have to go to one site, you gain too much control that you don't get. So I think we're going to have to figure out that tension of how to leverage the distribution networks that we have, but at the same time, ensure that we control and maximize the high-risk populations.
There is a opportunity here, though, particularly for pharmacists in both hospital and community. If the prioritization matrix is well established and agreed to before the vaccine comes along, that would allow the pharmacies themselves to be another distribution node for the vaccine without loss of that control.
Yeah.
But what you're really relying on then is you're really relying on it being crystal clear that there's been public debate, it's been challenged, and there's been an agreement to this is the prioritization, this is who's going to get it first, this is who's getting it second, and so on down the line.
Yeah, one thing I do have to say is that pharmacists are really good at following rules. So we should be the ones to do.
We are, absolutely, yeah.
Oh, just I agree with you, Alan.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of time, and that is a great note to leave it on. And I hope that this conversation will inspire people to get involved in more conversations about the equity and fairness dimensions of allocating drugs and vaccines in this outbreak. And I hope that everyone enjoyed today, please feel free to continue to submit your questions, and we will do our best to answer them on our website following the seminar. And thank you so much to our panelists and our wonderful assistants, Kate and Steve. Thank you.